Welcome everyone to this FWR webinar, Planning Citizen Science Monitoring of Rivers. Thank you for joining. This webinar has been organised by the Foundation for Water Research, or the FWR. They are an independent community of professionals from across the water sector and related scientific specialisms. The community comes together for deliberative discussion to support the development of interdisciplinary solutions to water challenges and are the water community within the IES family. I'll share a link in the chat shortly, once we get started, where you can sign up for the free FWR newsletter to stay up to date with all of their work. And we're pleased to be joined today by our speakers, Paul Hume and Simon Browning. So Paul is technical lead and Simon monitoring technical lead at the Rivers Trust, and they're both currently working on the CastCo project. At the end of their presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A, and you can submit your questions at any point during the presentation using the Q&A function, and I will read those out on your behalf later on. So you should be able to see the Q&A function just there towards the bottom of your screen. That's everything from me, so I'll pass over to Paul and Simon. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Well, thanks for coming along and thanks for inviting us along to speak. So yes, and thanks B for the introduction. So Paul and I are going to talk about the CastCo project with a kind of emphasis on the monitoring planning side of it. Let's get going. So the CastCo project was really kind of thought of 5 or 6 years ago. It came out of the catchment data user group meetings where as a cohort, if you like, the catchment-based approach, participants were really wrestling with the fact that the database we had, the evidence base we had from statutory environmental agency monitoring was getting very thin on the ground, and really we had very little confidence in its suitability, I suppose, for directing actions and activities on the ground. So if you imagine you've got a finite and thin resource to make interventions into river systems, you really want to be confident that you're putting those resources in the right place. And we didn't really have that confidence. At the same time, lots of our rivers, all of our rivers are in a pretty sorry state for one reason or another. And we were seeing at the same time this kind of real groundswell, which has actually continued much more since, in kind of enthusiasm for volunteer monitoring citizen science. We kind of use the terms interchangeably, but at the time, certainly, and even now, citizen science was seen as kind of a little bit flaky. It wasn't trusted, and it certainly wasn't fully embedded into the kind of decision-making processes. So we had this kind of mismatch, a real need for more data, more and better data. And this potential resource that will enable us to collect that data, but this kind of lack of join up between, what the potential of that data being realized, if you like. So that's how we came up with essentially the CastCo project. There's a slight variance in terms in that the original idea was this catchment monitoring cooperative, which is the kind of the standardized framework to put citizen science on a standardized on a sort of level playing field, I suppose. And then, as is often the way with these things, we were looking for a funding source. The one that popped up at the right time and said yes to the idea was the Ofwat Innovation Fund. And that involved taking the catchment monitoring cooperative idea and bolting on a couple of existing, or a number of existing or other proposals from the water industry. So that's why we've gone from the catchment monitoring cooperative to the CastCo project. In real terms, the catchment monitoring cooperative is the bulk of what we'll be talking about today. The sort of the CastCo bolt-ons allow us to kind of trial it at scale in some of the demonstration catchments. So these are where we're currently running demos. There are a couple of more that have been added. So the sort of affiliate demos that haven't quite got the full, haven't been in since the beginning. One on the Tyne, and we're also working with Bristol Avon Rivers Trust to an extent. And these are kind of our test beds. So this is where the stuff that people are running fast and doing novel stuff, and then tend to feed that back into the center where we can kind of disseminate best practice. There's a little bit of us leading from the center as well. So it's always been that sort of to and fro. The idea, the sort of deliverables, if you like, the main chunks of CastCo were going to be, bear in mind, we're sort of building a framework here for sort of accredited citizen science almost. So it comprises a few things, one of which was this charter, the kind of rules for taking part. So this understanding of a kind of a contract between the volunteers taking part, giving their valuable time, and the people administering or supporting those schemes, providing the right tools, techniques, the protocols, and the guidance to ensure they could collect data of a known quality. The planning aspect is a massive part of that, and we'll come on to exactly why that was. And there's also an understanding that the data will be open and shared wherever possible. So the charter has kind of evolved into these principles, which are now on the Casco website. There's a link there. Please do have a look at the website. There's lots of stuff on there. Because it got quite tricky on sort of untangling exactly all the scenarios we could think of where conflicts might happen. So that sort of charter work is still in process, but it did allow us to kind of distill out of that these principles, which you can read for yourself and look on the website. And we're kind of, the call is out there now to, if you're a volunteer monitoring group or organization supporting volunteers, and you can sign up to these principles, we're sort of inviting people to kind of join Casco, which kind of means becoming part of that community. So just a little bit about the planning then. This is borrowed from the Chesapeake Monitoring Cooperative, which was a real inspiration for what we were doing with Casco. And of course, there are people out monitoring rivers. We tend to think of catchment partnership units, so there's kind of management catchments as our sort of unit where this could work really well. And you often have lots of different stakeholders, whether that's the Environment Agency, the water companies, universities, research organizations, NGOs, community activist groups, all doing sort of environmental monitoring of varying degrees, and in some places none. So the idea of getting all those stakeholders around a table, sometimes a virtual table, to discuss their kind of objectives, which is, obviously critically important. Where are they coming from? What are they trying to achieve? And then lead them through how they're going to do it, where they're going to do it, what they'll be able to do with the data, who they expect to enact any changes that need to happen in those catchments. This kind of stuff is the kind of the bundle of which we're really sort of working with the demos to produce the planning. There's a real key kind of aspect of this that documents those procedures, so that if one group is using a particular method, and bear in mind this data is kind of designed to be open and shared, then other stakeholders coming along and picking up that data need to be able to know whether or not they can trust it and whether it's fit for the purposes they have in mind. So enshrining all that in a monitoring plan, preferably a collaborative monitoring plan, is fundamentally the sort of approach we've taken with the demos. One thing that kind of fell out partway through was when we started talking to 8/9 demonstration catchments, if you like, about what their objectives were and about what the monitoring questions they were asking were. We got up probably about 40 or 50 discrete monitoring questions back. It was going to be really helpful for us to try and categorize those into types, such that we could then say, okay, you're looking at this type of monitoring question. We can then link that through to suggested methods, suggested quality assurance methods, suggested data outputs, and suggested kind of impact pathways. So this type of monitoring question would be best suited to this type of data collection, this type of visualization, interpretation of that data, that will help these people make these decisions differently. So really helping to guide people through from that, what do I want to do, taking them through the planning process a bit with guidance to say, and this is how we'll do it, and this is the end result. And so you can see we've come up there with the kind of the four categories really, from education and engagement to sort of ecosystem health screening, and then investigative and evaluation. So those are the broad categories we've found. They seem to work pretty well for all the eventualities we've had, but again, we're inviting people to sort of test this and say, well, this doesn't work for this scenario. Let us know if we've missed a category there somewhere. So related to that, as again, a lot of people when they get started on this, they're bombarded with a whole range of different tools and techniques they can use. Knowing which ones are most appropriate for which purposes is a key part of what we're trying to do. So I use the example here of phosphate testing, which is one of the methods we've taken through the method audit process first off. So we started out with tiers 1, 2, and 3, and then we introduced tier 0 on the bottom. So the idea is, as you go up the pyramid, the equipment gets more sophisticated, more accurate, more fiddly, more expensive, and that pretty much means that fewer people will use it. So there's something to be gained from wide mass appeal schemes that use low technology or no technology, but do involve hundreds and thousands of people. And as we go through the planning process and understanding our purposes, there are some scenarios where higher end, more accurate techniques, higher cost, more training requirements, fewer people is the right way to go. There's as I said at the beginning, there's this kind of perception that citizen science is of low quality. And whilst we have never really argued in the Casco project that it would replace statutory monitoring, there's definitely an argument that it can produce very high quality data as well. It really comes back to that tiered approach. Yes, it can get very high quality data, but probably not very much of it. So what we sort of lean towards understanding the quality of the data and where those tier 1 techniques are appropriate for what you're trying to do, and where you really need to delve into a bit more rigor around and invest more in the equipment to produce sort of a higher tier monitoring data. But we'd also say that quality assurance, that quality management, if you like, runs throughout the whole thing, from how you do your training to how you advise people to enter data. And here's an example from one of the demos. So this is quite method specific, where they've looked at correlating one of the low cost phosphate methods. This is the little Hannah green egg, Hannah checker, that is kind of about 80-90 pounds. So well within the kind of grass, but not that tier 1 dissemination. And comparing that with lab samples, so a really good correlation that gives us the confidence, and the Environment Agency, water companies, the confidence that this data, when those methods are used correctly, can produce really good results. The other graph here is the nitrate comparison. This is using test strips, so much nearer to the tier 1 end of things, where you get this kind of indicative kind of result. Well, that can also be really useful for some things, but there's different use cases where that data would be more or less helpful. And then I think the last slide from me is just, we picked up this work. This is work that was done by Earthwatch, I think, originally, or certainly appeared in the Science of Citizen Science, and then was used, repeated again in the Role of Citizen Science report that Earthwatch did for the Environment Agency. And it really kind of resonated with me. So I've been working with citizens and scientists in the West Country for probably 5 or 6 years before I joined the Rivers Trust and Casco. And the idea is that, we're striving all the time for these high quality data sets that can provide long-term, trends and might inform government policy or the Environment Agency's behaviour or monitoring practices. Well, yes, but that can take many, many years. And in the meantime, you find out from day one, as soon as you take volunteers on a training course and introduce them to the idea that, cattle poaching is a problem, or what sewage fungus is, why algae in rivers might be an issue, you really kind of open their sort of perception, if you like, of what river issues look like. And that necessarily kind of involves or stimulates behavioural change at that individual level. Then they talk about it in the pub and down the library or wherever, and you start to find that communities who take on even quite basic water quality or river surveying methods, if you like, become much more informed, and they do start talking to their local councillors, they do start talking to their local MPs in a way that really resonates with those. So we are seeing a whole range of impact pathways, is what the paper kind of refers to them as, becoming available to this data. And the sort of the feedback loop there is, if you bear in mind these impact pathways at the outset, when you're designing, when you're doing your monitoring planning, then you can make slight changes to how you communicate what you're doing, or how you document what you're doing, to bring on board some of these other impact pathways that you might not have thought of at the outset. So I'm going to hand over to Paul now, my colleague, and Paul, you'll just have to give me a little nod or something when you want me to flick on the slides.
I will do that. Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting us to talk today, B. And I'm going to talk really a bit more about. Simon's talked about the why, have a monitoring plan. I'm going to talk to you a bit more about some of the things to consider when producing a monitoring plan, and then show some examples of the kind of monitoring questions that demos have been aiming to answer, and how they're using the data to have an impact and create change, similar to what Simon was saying was so important a minute ago. Next slide, Simon. In most of our demos, the partners sort of met together 2, sometimes 3 times to discuss and answer some key questions related to these 6 questions, really. So their objectives, their concerns, their monitoring questions, which we'll look at, as I say, in a minute. What they want to measure to answer their questions. So fundamentally, that's what people always think about. What are you going to measure? And then how to use their data to create change, the impact that Simon was talking about, and importantly, who they will work with, and just agreeing and recording these very basic questions yields an initial monitoring plan, which can be updated as they go along. Some people, when we first started talking about monitoring plans, envisaged hefty tomes that would sort of gather dust on a shelf somewhere, whereas in fact, what we've been talking about is sometimes a page in a Word document and 6, 7, 8 lines in a spreadsheet. So not a monitoring plan that's set in stone, but something that can be changed as you go along, because obviously as you gather more data, then some of the things you thought you were trying to do may well change. Simon, next slide. And as Simon also mentioned, we do really focus on encouraging people to plan collaboratively, so they can find out where their different concerns coincide, a bit like the circles in a Venn diagram. So Simon mentioned typical partners in our demonstration catchments, and where we're working with people across the country are wildlife trusts, rivers trusts, water companies, regulator, university, local action groups, friends of groups, local councils are getting more involved and more interested in this, and that collaboration in the planning, in answering those 6 questions that I showed you a minute ago, often leads to the plan being jointly owned, which is no bad thing, so that the data is taken seriously, and that it's got a place to go, it's got a home to go to when it starts to tell a story. And also collaboratively planning things helps with the expertise and the potential solutions that are held within different organizations, and sometimes funding being able to be shared. We've had many cases where people from water companies or from the Environment Agency, their employees have helped enormously with volunteer days, doing things like comparing with lab samples, or bringing out different kinds of test kit for volunteers to try, or giving training in how to use certain test kits. So all of that is really valuable in terms of collaboration. Next slide, Simon, please. So several demos used a spreadsheet to record their planning, and this is just some of the columns. I'll show you this in the next slide with all the columns in it. So each row here shows a different agreed monitoring activity. And so the monitoring aim in column B, the why, is written as a question. As I said, I'll show you some of those later. And then this spreadsheet also includes information on the purpose, which Simon mentioned in column A, the relevant background data. You're not collecting data in a vacuum, but what's the background data that already exists, held by other organizations, the Environment Agency, maybe the local angling trust or whoever. And then, the use of the data and obviously what's going to be measured. And this is what I mean by it's not a complicated document, this plan. It can be something really quite simple. Next slide, please, Simon. These are the other columns, the kind of things that you would expect to see. So what are you going to measure? What methods are you going to use? Are you going to use test strips? Are you going to use little kind of green eggs or what? Where, specifically where? you know, and that is related to the question that you will have formulated as to why you want to monitor. Maybe it's, you know, upstream and downstream of something, or in a particular area where you're concerned. What QA procedures will you use? When? I mean, is it time dependent? Or are you more interested in certain times of year or whatever? Who's going to do it? Storage of the data, and then really importantly, the priority of whether, because people often in this situation we found come up with more activities than you can possibly do in the first year. And that's fine, that's really good, that's encouraging. But you do need to focus on what your resources can manage. And so that priority column is to say, okay, we've got 10 things we've said we're going to do here. We're going to do these 3 or 4 in the first year. Next one, please, Simon. So I mentioned monitoring questions. What questions do you want your monitoring to answer? We'll look at some of these. So the Bean demo catchment included these 3 questions in their monitoring plan and are using a variety of methods, monitoring methods to answer them. So they're interested in the habitat baseline. So they're using MORPH, the hydromorphological survey technique to use that. They're interested in macroinvertebrates, so they're using Riverfly for that. Sources of sediment, so they're using MudSpotter for that. And then in terms of discharges to the Stevenage Brook, they're using Outfall Safari. Next slide, please, Simon. And then the Arun demo down in, so the Bean is in Hertfordshire, the previous one. The Arun is down in West Sussex. One of their monitoring questions was, they've got some water quality monitoring questions, but they had a really interesting soil monitoring question, which is what monitoring methods can farmers use? Farmers are citizens, so they're citizens, they can be citizen scientists. What can farmers use to monitor their soil health and create better soils and improve water quality on their farms? And so a small group of farmers are working with our volunteer coordinator. I think there are only 5 at the moment, but so it's a small group. And they're, as I say, monitoring the health of the soil on their farms. The aim is to improve both their soils and the water quality on these farms. And this is really relevant because the Arun catchment is suffering from large losses of soil due to erosion from sandy farmland. So that ends up in the river, which is not good for the river, but it's lost from the farmland, which is not good for agriculture and the farmer either. Next slide, please, Simon. Yeah, how will you use your data to create change? We always encourage our volunteer groups when they're planning to think about, and Simon mentioned this, you know, what changes they want to see in the river. You know, what's the big picture? Take a step back. Usually it's some kind of health improvement in the river, but it may be something very specific. And how they might use their data to sort of create that change is something that we encourage them to record. I mean, at the beginning of a volunteer monitoring program, this may not be that clear, but even just the outline of an idea is useful to include in the collaborative monitoring plan. And then as the monitoring continues, month on month and year on year, it often becomes clearer how that data can be used. But to actively think about it is something that we encourage. Next slide, please, Simon. So one example of this comes from the Wensum demo in East Anglia, just north of Norwich. One of their monitoring questions asks how they could work with the Environment Agency to support the reporting of pollution incidents. And the volunteer coordinator has been working with the local Environment Agency land and water team leader. And she's agreed, and their team has agreed, how the volunteers can report in pollution incidents. So they can report in as usual to the Environment Agency national hotline. That's what all of us can do. But they've agreed there that that volunteers who are out on site and see something, they can report directly to the local team so that the local agency team sees the report sooner and, if needed, can respond sooner. And the agency has deliberately, as part of this, trained the volunteers on what to report and what not to report. There's quite a long training set of slides. I've picked out a few of those slides that they received. So, for example, if they get high ammonia readings from their ammonia checker, then that can indicate significant organic pollution, such as sewage. So if the ammonia checker is reading high, then they're asked to repeat the check. And if it still reads high, so above 5 milligrams per litre, then to report it to the agency in the way that I just described. Next slide, please, Simon. Fairly obviously, maybe dead or distressed fish is something that the agency ask the volunteers to report if they see that. So they may be going out and measuring for something entirely different, but if they see something like that, then to report it. And then there's a whole bunch of things, next slide, please, Simon, that they told them not to report because they're naturally occurring things that they don't need reporting. So foam with a sort of fishy or an earthy smell, filamentous algae, duckweed, watermeal, green algae, and tree pollen on the water. Next slide, please, Simon. So another example of citizen science data being used is from the Ribble demonstration catchment in the northwest. In the last few weeks, they've been looking at how their citizen science data can be included in the agency's eutrophication risk assessment tool. So this spreadsheet tool assesses the risk of eutrophication due to enrichment by nutrients, nitrogen and phosphate, which can damage river health. And it uses multiple agency data sets, so predominantly phosphate, diatoms and macrophyte monitoring by the agency to provide a risk score for each water body. Now, in many cases, the risk score is uncertain. And so they are having conversations to see whether they can include the citizen science data into that tool. Next slide, please, Simon. So there, the Ribble group are sharing in particular their phosphate and nitrate concentrations because they have data in places that the agency are not necessarily going and not as frequently, perhaps. Invertebrate counts from riverfly and their records of algae. So they're exploring how that data might be included in the tool. We don't have the results of that yet, but that's something that's happening, now as we speak. And one final thing that I wanted to mention, which was an interesting development in terms of using citizen science data, because every volunteer wants to know how their data, and quite rightly, wants to know how their data can be used to improve the river, is conversations we have had recently with 2 water companies who have agreed to investigate how citizen science data can be taken into account as part of the national cycle of agency water company WINEP projects, the Water Industry National Environment Programme projects that are on the regular 5-year cycle. And the kind of thing we're thinking of is citizen science monitoring, which may provide supporting evidence, not definitive regulatory or statutory evidence, but supporting evidence that, for example, small rural sewage treatment works might need some attention, and if there's data being collected around those which the agency may not have, then that can feed into the WINEP deliberations as to the future projects. So next slide, thank you very much. The link to the next one, Simon, please. The link to the Casco website shown on this slide has more guidance on producing a collaborative monitoring plan. So thanks very much, everybody. And if you've got any questions, ask the questions now.
Thank you very much, both of you. And as Paul just said, please feel free to pop any questions you have in the Q&A box, which you can find towards the bottom of your screen. Just got a couple of questions that have come through, but we have around 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes for any remaining ones. So one here is, how did you select the demo catchment areas?
Shall I take
You
that
want
one?
to say? I'll take it if you like. Yeah.
Go on then.
And you can tell me whether I know you know something. You were involved also earlier than me. I understand that it was a conversation around places where there wasn't necessarily citizen science work going on already. So some places were mooted, but they'd already got citizen science work going on, so they weren't necessarily included. Places so that we could get a variety of geographies, river types, and geologies, and settings. So chalk and sandstone streams, upland and lowland, and also importantly different parts of the country. And then I think it was also so that there was a spread amongst all the water companies, because Ofwat is obviously money that's being used within the water company sector. Simon, have I missed anything?
Nope, that's spot on.
Thank you very much. Okay, so moving to the next question. Which water companies have agreed to use citizen science data and use in WINEP?
So they haven't agreed they'll do it. They've agreed to go and find out if they can do it, if there's a pathway to do it. And it's Severn Trent and United Utilities. But that's merely because they were the two people in the conversation at the time. It doesn't, I mean, I think Southwest Water had somebody at the same meeting and were interested and heard about the conversation. But I mean, the other water companies were not in on the conversation. So it wasn't, it was a small conversation that two of the water companies have taken an action to go away and then report back to everybody the next time that everybody's there.
Thank you very much. So the next question is, with the reducing resource given to the Environment Agency and the former government guidance for the EA not to enforce, for which DEFRA lost in court, what kinds of evidence are most impactful to enable the agency to take action?
Interesting. I would say, and actually it kind of links to the next question as well. So there are some parameters that we can have quite a high degree of confidence in with low cost citizen science methods, and others that aren't quite so clear cut. And there are some that kind of really are very well aligned with what the agency are looking for. So we do find the nutrients, particularly phosphate, ammonia is particularly interesting. It allows them to take action quickly. And then I suppose the other one that is often under kind of emphasized is the observational data. You know, a lot of along with the water testing or the survey techniques, most of our schemes, and certainly we're encouraging demos to kind of, whilst volunteers are out there, get them collecting, you know, wildlife sightings, invasive species sightings, observational, you know, so the visual indicators, what the EA used to be called, you know, the aesthetic sort of indicators of problems in rivers, whether that's algae or foam or sewage fungus or runoff. And actually that is really useful in helping guide the agency. And what we see then is often the action that takes place is not direct, you know, prosecutions or pollutions or even investigations, but kind of directing monitoring effort into those places. But it's still quite a sort of a fledgling process, I suppose, in exactly how the agency responds. The demos have been really useful because what we found is the reaction from the agency as a national body at the beginning of the project was a little bit kind of, well, certainly very cautious. We've seen them build confidence nationally by how the local demos have reacted to that close working and that involvement in the planning phase, I'd say.
Thank you very much, Simon. You happy for me to move to the next question?
Mm-hmm. I am, yep.
So the next one says, most interesting presentation, your two graphs, phosphate and I think nitrate, showed that phosphate seemed to be easy to determine using a basic kit, whereas other parameters are much more tricky. This would accord exactly with research I have done years ago with undergrads and postgrads. I found conductivity the easiest to determine and use as an indicator. Any comments on parameters, accuracy, and ease of use?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in the water quality field. So again, Casco set out to demonstrate an approach for method auditing. It was never our intention to audit all the methods out there available, and so we took phosphate through that process first, and we're quite a long way down, as you'll have picked up from the presentation. The HANA checkers are coming out as one of our recommended methods, if you like, for the appropriate tier. We are looking at sort of starting the audit process for a whole range of other parameters, and exactly what Carolyn has said there. You know, there are some like nitrate that are of interest but are tricky to get, you know, kind of accurate data at low cost. There are other parameters, so pH is one that springs to mind, where again, whilst it might be of interest, the sort of confusion or the sort of ambiguity introduced by the instrumentation limits, if you like, mean that it probably wouldn't be on our recommended list. So whilst we haven't done it yet, there is this kind of preferred list or starter list, if you like. Dissolved oxygen is another good example where really, really interesting, but there aren't really reliable citizen science tools available yet to test that, and there's problems around exactly how you direct a sampling program to look at oxygen threats. But what this is doing is flagging up, these gaps that then as a kind of joint, customer, if you like, the Casco project with the water companies, with all the partners on board can start talking to these manufacturers and saying, well, look, this is an area where we could do with some development, and we are able now. We're working with universities to try and fill some of these gaps. Again, I would agree conductivity, in terms of cost value for money. You can get some very reliable and accurate probes for a very low cost, but then the challenge is explaining to volunteers, well, what does a high conductivity mean? Because the minute you put a tool in someone's hand to measure something, of all the things you could measure, you're giving them conductivity and phosphate. It kind of tells them that those are the most important things. And so part of what we've done with the method audit is provide that kind of background. We call it a sort of aid memoir to phosphorus, so that we can point people towards that, and other ones will be coming for, explainers, if you like, for conductivity, nitrate, all the other parameters, so that people can go to the Casco website and kind of get that understanding of what it is, what it means when it's high, what a normal value is, and what part it plays in the monitoring kind of a toolkit.
Great, thank you very much. So on to the last couple of questions here. Can the monitoring approaches presented be applied to support construction projects near, under or over rivers, including ordinary water crossings?
I'll say something about that, Simon, from my local experience. I've not heard of the demos using the demos I'm involved with closely, using their monitoring to do. I guess you're meaning something like before and after a development or a construction project, or before, during, and after, maybe. But I do know that my local catchment partnership in the Staffs Trent Valley are thinking, with some housing development that's planned in the next few years, because this is a focus area for housing from the government, that they will be doing that. They'll be using both ecological, biological, and water quality techniques to look at things before and after. And there's no real reason why that can't be done. But I'm sure when it is done, we'll learn things, and we, as always with a lot of this work, we're learning what works and what doesn't as we go along. And so that's why we've got the website, really, so that learning can be passed on to other people. So yes, it can be, and there are some plans to do it locally to me. But what about you, Simon? Anybody doing it near you?
Well, what I was going to say on that is essentially that's why we point people through the sort of the planning process, because if that's your question, about the impact of construction, then you can kind of break that down and say, okay, what is going to be most helpful for me to measure in this situation, whether that's turbidity for looking at sediment, or downstream invertebrates, looking at the impact of potential before and afters, and pick the right tier of data that will influence the people you're trying to influence. If you're talking to developers who have got a big planning project or big development in mind, then maybe test strips won't provide the data of sufficient robustness to kind of influence their decisions, or the people who can influence their decisions. So I mean, I think yes they can be, if that's the objective from the outset, and the planning process kind of the monitoring plan process kind of takes that into account.
And I think, Simon, that shows the importance of of collaboration. I mean, in that situation, you'd have a monitoring plan. It would be very, much more valuable to have a monitoring plan that was shared with the local council, if they were the people who were responsible for managing the developers, and probably the Environment Agency, so that you all know that this is going on, and that citizen scientists are part of that program of monitoring. It's not just something that they're surprised by.
There's a great line in the Chesapeake guidance that kind of says, don't to community groups, don't just assume that the person you expect to make the change will be, gladly receive your data and act on it. And so really talk to them at the outset, saying, we think this is an issue. We'd like you to consider this, outcome. Then talk to them about the kind of data that they might need to kind of the level of robustness they would need to convince them that, you know, what you're seeing is a real issue or not.
Yeah, it's like rehearsing that sort of, well, if we get this data, then is it any use to the
Yeah.
people who can make a difference on decisions? Yeah.
Great, thank you. So the last question, is the chemical data you're collating harmonized with Riverfly partnership and other volunteer biological data to add greater acuity to likely hotspots and causes?
In some places, yes, Mark. And again, part of the sort of reason behind, well, it's partly practical, but the benefit, if you like, of running the demos concurrently and kind of having the central Casco hub, if you like, comparing approaches, allows us to allows people to do their own thing, but at the same time we bring everyone up to speed with what is working, what isn't. So working closely with the FBA, they're part of the project, and Riverfly is definitely one of the approved methods or the recommended methods that we're taking through the audit process. And we are, wherever possible, kind of making demos and others aware of the benefits of aligning those water quality and biological monitoring programs. They haven't all done it yet. A lot of them are, but even more of them plan to. And we're also kind of working with Bill Briley to look at sort of other formalizing ways of doing algae assessments, say. So the importance of those observational indicators of kind of impact and the biological, the structured biological data in tandem with the water quality, yes, it's very important and definitely something we are recommending people take into account. And
I think, Simon, that one of the things we've just produced a pilot for that we're going to try with the demos is we've got a what we're calling the Casco Data Hub, which is, it's got lots of, not too many, but the idea is to have about 20 or so data sets. Like, for example, where are all the Angling Trust monitoring points? Where are the agency monitoring points? You know, the Riverfly monitoring points, so that people who are collecting citizen science data can see what data is available beyond what they're doing and where is it being collected, because that just helps them to do that coordination that you mentioned there, Mark.
Brilliant. Well, thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you once again to Paul and Simon for presenting and for everyone for attending today. We'll wrap up here. So this webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel. If you're watching the recording on YouTube, please subscribe to our channel, like the video, and hit the bell to gain notifications of new content. If you're an IES member, don't forget to record your attendance at this webinar in our CPD tool by logging into the IES members area. And if you've enjoyed today's webinar and you're not a member, please do consider joining the EIS as a member. The next FWR webinar will be held on the 26th of March and is on harnessing BNG to amplify urban flood risk management. You can register for this now on the FWR or IES website. For now, thank you to everyone for attending and for taking part, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.